When a killer is finally caught, the towns they terrorized breathe a collective sigh of relief, knowing that the monster will never get the chance to take another innocent life. The residents can finally sleep soundly at night, secure in the knowledge that justice has been served and the streets are safe once more. However, in today's harrowing case, the townspeople were lulled into a false sense of security, believing the nightmare was over when in reality, it had only just begun. A sexual deviant and brutal murderer managed to slip through the cracks of the justice system and escape police custody, leaving a trail of blood and terror in his wake. Today, we delve into the disturbing case of Alain Legere, a man dubbed the Monster of Miramichi, who escaped prison after murdering an elderly man during a robbery and then remained at large for 7 agonizing months, during which he continued to take innocent lives with impunity. Alain Legere's story begins on February 13, 1948, in the rural community of Chatham Head, New Brunswick, Canada. Born into a large, impoverished family, Legere's early life was marred by hardship and dysfunction. His father, a heavy drinker and a volatile man, was largely absent from his son's life before completely abandoning the family when Legere was still a child. Left to fend for herself, Legere's mother struggled to raise her children in squalid conditions, often forcing them to sleep together in cramped, overcrowded rooms. It was in this environment that Legere's life of sexual deviance and violence began to take root. As he grew older, Legere began to exhibit disturbing behavior, particularly towards his sisters. He would later admit that his deviant sexual urges first manifested in the family home, where he would masturbate while watching his sisters undress. This voyeuristic behavior eventually evolved into a full-blown paraphilia, with Legere peeping through windows to spy on other women and engaging in public masturbation from a disturbingly young age. It was clear that something was deeply wrong with the young Legere, but in the insular, tight-knit community of Chatham Head, his behavior went largely unchecked. Outside the home, Legere was a loner who displayed markedly antisocial behavior. He struggled to form meaningful connections with his peers and was frequently in trouble with the law for petty crimes and acts of vandalism. The few acquaintances he did have were often unsavory characters themselves, drawn to Legere's dark, brooding persona and his penchant for violence. Another factor that may have contributed to Alain Legere's downward spiral was the tragic loss of his brother, who was also his best friend. When the boys were teenagers, Legere's brother was run over by a truck and killed, leaving Legere devastated and further alienated from his family. In a shocking display of cruelty, Legere's own mother told him that the truck should have hit him instead of his brother, a statement that undoubtedly left deep emotional scars on the already troubled young man. As Legere entered adulthood, he cut an imposing figure. Standing well over 6 feet tall, and with a muscular build honed by his love of weightlifting, he found work as a mechanic, a job that suited his solitary nature and allowed him to indulge his fascination with machines. Despite his good job and his pride in his physical appearance, Legere's lack of social skills and his increasingly erratic behavior led him to a life of solitude. He eventually settled on a remote farm, far from the prying eyes of neighbors and the judgment of the community. It was here, in the isolation of the New Brunswick countryside, that Legere's dark desires began to fester. He had acquaintances, but they were not the right kind: petty criminals, drug users, and other social outcasts who enabled and encouraged his worst impulses. As Legere slipped further into a life of crime, his lack of social skills, his deviant sexual urges, and his propensity for violence created a perfect storm of dangerous impulses. It was only a matter of time before this volatile combination would explode into something truly monstrous. The first major turning point in Alain Legere's criminal career came on June 21, 1986. On that fateful night, Legere and his accomplices, Todd Matchett and Scott Curtis, carried out a brutal robbery at an all-night convenience store in Black River Bridge, New Brunswick. After cutting the power to the store, the 3 men stormed inside, brandishing weapons and demanding money from the elderly couple who owned the establishment, John and Mary Glendenning. What happened next was an act of senseless violence that shocked the tight-knit community to its core. Not content with simply robbing the Glendennings, the trio viciously beat the defenseless couple, showing no mercy as they rained down blows on their frail bodies. The attack took on an even more sinister tone when Legere and his accomplices decided to sexually assault Mary Glendenning, subjecting her to a horrific ordeal that left her battered, bruised, and traumatized. When Mary finally regained consciousness, she made a heartbreaking discovery. Her beloved husband, John, had succumbed to the injuries inflicted by the ruthless attackers. Frightened, in excruciating pain, and utterly disoriented, Mary summoned the last of her strength to crawl to the stairs where the phone was located. With trembling hands, she managed to dial the police, gasping out a desperate plea for help before collapsing once more. The police response was swift and decisive. Despite the perpetrators fleeing the crime scene, leaving behind a trail of destruction and a shattered community, the authorities managed to track down Legere and his accomplices in short order. Faced with the overwhelming evidence against them, Todd Matchett chose to plead guilty to the murder of John Glendenning and the brutal beating of Mary, while Curtis and Legere opted to take their chances at trial. For most killers, this would have been the end of the line. But Alain Legere was no ordinary criminal. With a cunning mind and a complete lack of remorse, he began to devise a way to outsmart the authorities and secure a second chance at unleashing his reign of terror upon the unsuspecting populace. While being held in pretrial custody at the maximum security prison in Rennes, New Brunswick, Legere put his considerable charm and manipulative skills to work. He managed to ingratiate himself with the prison staff, presenting a facade of cooperation and remorse that belied his true nature. So convincing was his act that on May 3, 1989, when Legere complained of an ear infection, the guards agreed to escort him to a nearby hospital for treatment, a decision that would prove to have devastating consequences. In a shocking display of negligence, the guards who accompanied Legere to the hospital were unarmed, a fact that the cunning killer was quick to exploit. Once inside the hospital, Legere managed to convince his captors to allow him to use the washroom unsupervised, an incredible lapse in judgment that would come back to haunt them. The guards' faces must have gone white with shock and disbelief when they discovered that the dangerous inmate had somehow managed to pick the locks on his handcuffs and leg irons, freeing himself from his restraints. But the worst was yet to come. Moments later, Legere emerged from the washroom brandishing a homemade knife, a lethal weapon that he had managed to keep hidden from the prison staff. In the chaos that ensued, Legere made his bold escape, sprinting out of the building and into the hospital parking lot. There, he targeted Peggy Olive, a woman who had the misfortune of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Holding her at knife point, Legere forced Peggy into her car and sped off, leaving the stunned guards in his dust. Miraculously, Peggy Olive managed to escape from Legere's clutches unharmed, a rare moment of mercy from a man who would go on to commit unspeakable acts of violence. But for the people of New Brunswick, the nightmare was just beginning. In the days and weeks following his escape, Legere embarked on a brutal crime spree that left the province reeling in terror. Robberies, assaults, and car thefts became his modus operandi as he crisscrossed the region, always staying one step ahead of the law. But it was the string of brutal murders that truly cemented Legere's reputation as a monster in human form. On May 29, 1989, just a few short weeks after his escape, Legere struck again. His victims this time were two elderly sisters, Annie and Nina Flam, who lived in the small community of Chatham Head. The details of the attack are almost too horrific to recount. Legere, armed with his signature homemade knife, broke into the Flam sisters' home and proceeded to beat, torture, and sexually assault the helpless women, all while ransacking their humble abode for valuables. But the horror didn't end there. In a twisted attempt to cover his tracks and destroy any incriminating DNA evidence, Legere set fire to the Flam's grocery store, which was attached to their home. The thick smoke and searing flames quickly engulfed the building, trapping the battered sisters inside. By the time firefighters managed to extinguish the blaze and reach the women, it was too late. Annie Flam had already succumbed to her injuries, her body charred beyond recognition. As investigators combed through the ruins of the Flam sisters' home, they made a series of chilling discoveries. Traces of hair and semen were found among the ashes, tantalizing clues that hinted at the depravity of the killer's actions. But in a frustrating twist, the analysis of these samples yielded no concrete leads. leaving the police grasping at straws as they tried to track down the elusive Legere. It wasn't long before the Special Services Unit took over the case, and they quickly noticed the striking similarities between the Flam murders and the earlier attack on the Glendennings. The brutality, the sexual nature of the assaults, and the targeting of elderly victims all pointed to one man, Alain Legere. He became the prime suspect in the Flam case, but without hard evidence tying him to the crimes, the police were left to chase shadows. As the weeks turned into months, the people of New Brunswick lived in a constant state of fear, knowing that a monster was loose in their midst. Legere's reign of terror continued unabated, and the police seemed powerless to stop him. Desperate for any lead, no matter how small, the authorities offered a $2,000 reward for information leading to Legere's capture. Tips poured in from across the province, with some sightings placing the fugitive as far away as Toronto. But despite their best efforts, the police remained convinced that Legere was still lurking in the Miramichi area, hiding in plain sight as the region continued to be plagued by violent crimes. The depths of Legere's depravity knew no bounds. It became increasingly clear that his motives went beyond mere financial gain. He was a man who derived twisted pleasure from inflicting pain and terror on his victims. The sexual nature of his assaults spoke to a deep-seated perversion, a sickness that had taken root in his soul and now drove him to commit unspeakable acts. As the body count mounted, Legere grew bolder and more reckless. On September 30th, 1989, he struck again, this time targeting a 70-year-old man named Maurice Doran in the town of Miramichi. In a brazen daylight attack, Legere shot Doran in the back, leaving him for dead on the streets of the quiet community. The very next day, he invaded yet another home, viciously assaulting an elderly couple, Edwin and Angelina Russell, in a manner that was becoming all too familiar to the terrified residents of New Brunswick. But it was the murder of the Donny sisters, Linda and Donna, on October 14, 1989, that truly shocked the province to its core. Firefighters, responding to reports of smoke billowing from the sisters' home, made a grisly discovery upon entering the burning building. The bodies of Linda and Donna were found inside, brutally beaten and sexually assaulted, with one of the sisters lying lifeless in her bed. The similarities to the Flam murders were undeniable, and the police soon uncovered another disturbing connection. Alain Legere had once been in a relationship with Linda Donny. As the horrifying details of Legere's crimes began to circulate throughout the region, the people of Miramichi found themselves gripped by an all-consuming terror. Parents kept their children indoors, Halloween celebrations were canceled, and once trusting neighbors began locking their doors and windows, no longer feeling safe in their own homes. The monster of Miramichi had shattered the peace and innocence of an entire community, and there seemed to be no end in sight to his campaign of violence and fear. On November 16, 1989, Legere committed what would prove to be his final, and perhaps most shocking, attack. The target this time was a place of worship, the Church of the Blessed Virgin Mary, where 69-year-old Father James Smith lived and served his congregation. Legere, seeing an opportunity in the unlocked door of the church, crept inside under the cover of darkness. His twisted mind focused on finding something of value to steal. What transpired in the quiet, sacred space of that church is a mystery that only Legere himself can answer. What is known is that when Father Smith, alerted to the presence of an intruder, confronted the killer, a struggle ensued. The elderly priest, no match for the physically imposing Legere, was brutally beaten, his body left crumpled on the floor of the church rectory. It wasn't until Father Smith failed to appear for morning mass that the alarm was raised. When concerned parishioners and police entered the church, they were confronted with a scene of unimaginable horror. Father Smith's lifeless body lay in a pool of his own blood, his injuries bearing the hallmarks of Legere's savage handiwork. Nearby, the church safe stood open and empty, its contents pilfered by the killer before he fled the scene in a stolen car. The murder of Father James Smith was a turning point in the hunt for Alain Legere. The audacity of the crime, combined with the increasing pressure from a terrified public, spurred the police to intensify their efforts to bring the monster of Miramichi to justice. The reward for information leading to his capture was raised to a staggering $50,000, a testament to the desperate urgency of the situation. But despite the massive manhunt and the promise of a substantial reward, no one came forward with information on Legere's whereabouts. The killer's antisocial nature and lack of close personal connections had served him well, making it incredibly difficult for the authorities to track his movements or predict his next strike. The break in the case finally came on November 23, 1989, when Legere made a fateful decision that would ultimately lead to his downfall. On that cold, snowy evening, the fugitive killer hijacked a taxi, forcing the driver, Ron Gunk, to take him to the city of Moncton at gunpoint. As the terrified cabbie navigated the treacherous, icy roads, Legere sat in the back seat, his stolen gun trained on Gunk's head. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. As the taxi sped through the blinding snowstorm, Gunk lost control of the vehicle, sending it careening off the road and into a deep snowbank. Legere, thrown by the impact, momentarily lowered his guard, giving Gunk a precious opportunity to escape. The quick-thinking driver, seeing a passing car approaching through the swirling snow, leaped from the taxi and frantically waved down the other vehicle. The car, as it turned out, belonged to a young woman named Michelle Mercer. In a split second, she found herself face to face with the most wanted man in New Brunswick, his gun now pointed directly at her. Legere, desperate to continue his flight from justice, ordered Michelle to drive, keeping both her and Ron Gunk as hostages in the car. As Michelle navigated the treacherous back roads of the province, her mind raced with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. Legere, growing more agitated by the minute, repeatedly demanded that she take him to Moncton, his ultimate destination still unclear. But in a stroke of incredible good fortune, Michelle became disoriented in the blinding snowstorm, accidentally turning down a remote logging road instead of the main highway. Realizing her mistake, and with her fuel gauge edging towards empty, Michelle made a split-second decision that would change the course of history. She pulled into a small gas station, praying that the attendant would somehow recognize the danger she and Ron were in. Miraculously, as Legere's attention wavered for just a moment, the two hostages managed to tumble out of the car, stumbling through the snow and into the arms of the shocked gas station attendant. Legere, now alone and desperate, abandoned Michelle's car and quickly hijacked a nearby truck, ordering its driver, Bruin Balding, to take him to Moncton at gunpoint. But unbeknownst to the killer, Michelle had managed to alert the authorities during their brief stop at the gas station. The police, now hot on Legere's trail, quickly located the stolen truck and forced it to a stop. In a tense standoff on the side of the icy road, the monster of Miramichi was finally apprehended, his reign of terror brought to an abrupt and long overdue end. As Alain Legere was taken into custody, the people of New Brunswick collectively breathed a sigh of relief. The nightmare that had gripped the province for 7 long months was finally over, and the monster of Miramichi would never again walk free to terrorize the innocent. But even as the initial shock and horror of Legere's crimes began to fade, the scars he left on the community would linger for generations. In the aftermath of his capture, the true scope of Legere's depravity began to come to light. As investigators delved deeper into his background and the trail of violence he had left in his wake, they were confronted with a portrait of a man utterly devoid of empathy or remorse. The tally of his crimes was staggering. Multiple murders, countless assaults, and a string of robberies and thefts that stretched back years. But perhaps most chilling of all were the unanswered questions that continued to haunt the investigation. How many more victims had Legere claimed during his months on the run? What other unspeakable acts had he committed in the shadows, leaving no witnesses or evidence behind? The truth, it seemed, was a mystery that only the monster of Miramichi himself could fully unravel. As Legere's case made its way through the courts, the people of New Brunswick watched with a mixture of anger, revulsion, and a desperate need for closure. In August 1990, the killer was convicted on charges related to his escape from custody and sentenced to an additional 9 years in prison. But this was just the beginning of his legal reckoning. Over the next year, as Legere stood trial for the murders of the Flam sisters, the Donny sisters, and Father James Smith, a sense of justice began to take hold. In a groundbreaking development, prosecutors were able to introduce DNA evidence for the first time in a Canadian criminal trial, thanks to the cutting-edge forensic technology available at the Toronto-based Centre of Forensic Sciences. The DNA evidence, painstakingly collected from the crime scenes and meticulously analyzed by experts, provided an irrefutable link between Legere and his victims. Hairs, fibers, and traces of bodily fluids all pointed to the inescapable conclusion that the monster of Miramichi was, indeed, responsible for the brutal slayings that had terrorized the province. In November 1991, after a trial that captivated the nation, Alain Legere was found guilty on all counts of murder. The judge, in a stern and uncompromising tone, sentenced the killer to life in prison with no possibility of parole for a minimum of 25 years. It was a moment of catharsis for the victims' families and for the people of New Brunswick, who had lived for so long under the shadow of Legere's evil. But even as the province celebrated the verdict and the knowledge that the monster of Miramichi would spend the rest of his days behind bars, a lingering sense of unease remained. How had the system failed so catastrophically, allowing a dangerous and violent criminal like Legere to escape custody not once, but twice? What could be done to ensure that such a tragedy would never happen again? In the years that followed, as Legere was shuffled from one maximum security prison to another, the scars he had left on the psyche of New Brunswick began to slowly heal. Communities came together, united in their grief and their determination to rebuild the trust and sense of safety that had been so cruelly shattered. Memorials were held for the victims, their lives celebrated and their memories honored by those who had loved them. The Flam sisters, the Donny sisters, Father James Smith, and all the others whose lives had been cut short by Legere's brutality. They would never be forgotten, their legacies forever woven into the fabric of the province's history. As time marched on, the specter of Alain Legere continued to loom large in the collective consciousness of New Brunswick. His name became synonymous with evil, a cautionary tale whispered to children and a reminder of the darkness that could lurk in the hearts of men. In 2015, more than 2 decades after his conviction, Legere was transferred to a maximum security prison in Edmonton, Alberta. It was a move that brought a sense of relief to many in New Brunswick, who felt that the physical distance between the killer and the province he had once terrorized was a necessary step in the healing process. But even as Legere faded from the daily thoughts and conversations of most New Brunswickers, his legacy continued to cast a long shadow. In January 2021, when the killer became eligible for parole, a sense of collective anger and disbelief swept across the province. How could a man who had committed such heinous crimes, who had shattered so many lives and left such an indelible mark of pain and suffering, ever be considered for release? In the end, the parole board made the only decision it could. Faced with the overwhelming evidence of Legere's unrepentant nature and the lingering danger he posed to society, they denied his bid for freedom, ensuring that the monster of Miramichi would remain behind bars for the rest of his natural life. But even as the people of New Brunswick breathed a sigh of relief at the news, they knew that the legacy of Alain Legere would never truly fade away. The scars he had left on the province, both physical and emotional, would endure for generations, a haunting reminder of the evil that had once walked among them. And yet, even in the face of such darkness, the resilience and strength of the human spirit shone through. The communities that had been touched by Legere's violence, the families that had lost loved ones to his brutality, they had not only survived, but thrived in the face of unimaginable adversity. In the end, perhaps that is the true legacy of the monster of Miramichi. Not the trail of death and destruction he left in his wake, but the unwavering courage and determination of those who had faced the darkness and emerged on the other side, forever changed but unbroken. As the years continue to pass and the memories of Alain Legere's crimes slowly fade into history, the people of New Brunswick will never forget the lessons they learned from that terrible time. They will remember the importance of vigilance, of community, and of the unbreakable bonds that hold us together in the face of even the greatest evil. And they will remember, too, the power of justice, the knowledge that even the most monstrous among us will eventually be held accountable for their crimes. It is a lesson that echoes through the ages, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is always hope for a brighter tomorrow. So let the story of Alain Legere, the monster of Miramichi, stand as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, to the strength of a community that refused to be broken, and to the enduring power of justice in the face of unspeakable evil. For in the end, it is not the monsters who define us, but the way we rise above them, united in our shared humanity and our unwavering determination to build a better world for all.